speaking Pennsylvania Dutch, which is a German dialect that's spoken by over 300,000 people here in the US and Canada. And I got to ask him all the questions that I've always wondered about, like how often does he speak Pennsylvania Dutch in everyday life? Can he communicate with the Amish community? How does the language integrate new words for modern inventions? And why are more and more people from Germany building relationships with the Pennsylvania Dutch? Hello, servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio on and off since 2016. Last year, I made a video where I reacted to a few videos of people speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. Doug Madenford was one of them, and we ended up getting in touch with each other. And in the first part of this video that I'll link up here and down below for you, he tested how much I, as a native German speaker, can understand when he speaks Pennsylvania Dutch. After that, we had a really interesting conversation about the language and his experiences with it, and that's what you'll get to see in this video. I'm gonna put the timestamps for the different topics that we covered in the info box below, and we're gonna jump in right where we left off in part 1. We just talked about an expression that they have in Pennsylvania Dutch, which isn't a thing in modern German, but apparently was used in the Palatine dialect a couple hundred years ago.
And that's kind of one of the cool things about Pennsylvania Dutch is that we truly are a time capsule. Our language, we brought over in the 1700s, and for the most part, it stayed because there was no other German influence on it. There was English influence based on the people that were settling around us in our history, but we were truly a Sprachinsel. We were this language island that we were allowed to develop without any outside influence, where if you look, the people that stayed in Germany in the 1700s, well, German changed a lot in the time since. There was French influence, German itself changed, where we didn't have that outside influence on us. So there are words that we use and traditions that we do that are truly 300 years old. What I think is really cool, because not a lot of languages are able to be like frozen like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
So that's one of the cool things about Pennsylvania Dutch, among many other things, of course. But I think that's really neat that we have these old words that if you look in Felsish word dictionaries that were written in the 1700s and 1800s, you'll find them, but nobody uses them anymore, right?
That's
but
crazy,
we do. Yeah, it is totally crazy.
Yeah, and as you said, those are the origins. And of course, I'm not from those regions. I'm not from the Rhineland or Pfalz, or I don't really have a lot of interaction with like Swiss German either, which has like a few influences there.
Yeah, we do.
I'm from Bavaria, which I guess doesn't really have a whole lot in common with Pennsylvania Dutch. So even in my reaction video, I got roasted a little bit for not knowing your video, like Hinke or Hinge, because a lot of people said like, who doesn't know that word in Germany? And well, in Bavaria, we do not use that at all. I had never heard that before.
Right. Yeah, I traveled to Germany quite a bit. I'm very lucky that I'm able to do that. And I have been in Bavaria more than once. And I find that if I use my dialect in the Franken part, like Bamberg and Würzburg, then people will understand me. But if I'm in the South or in the Munich area, then it's a different story. And likewise, then I have a hard time. If someone's speaking Bavarian, I can understand things, kind of like you, like 70% maybe I'm getting. But beyond that, there'll be words that I'll be like, oh, I have no idea what that word is, So yeah, it's crazy the dialects that, and these accents that range around Germany. I try to tell my high school students this all the time. Germany's small compared to the United States, but they have so many regional differences. You can literally go from one town to the next and run into completely different words or different phrases. It's really fast. For me, it's fascinating as someone that loves languages.
I have that all the time that people ask me, oh, does Germany have as many accents and dialects as the US? And I'm always like, what do you mean, as many? Yeah, we have way more. Like, we're much older. I don't think that from all I know and what I've experienced that the US has a whole lot of dialects and accents nowadays. It's just such a young country and it just all merged so quickly. But yeah, in Germany too, dialects are getting lost with modern times, but they're still there, especially in rural areas.
Can I ask you a question in regards to that? So you're a younger German, and this is a battle that the Pennsylvania Dutch have been fighting too over the last 50 years. And so from your perspective as a young German, what role does dialect play for you?
Well, it really depends on whether you come from like a rural or urban area, and I'm from the city. And even though Munich is the capital of Bavaria and it's like in the heart of Bavaria, it's a very urban place. And people always say that in Munich you don't speak Bavarian dialect, you speak Münchnerisch, so like Munich dialect, which is basically just standard German mixed with a little bit of like Bavarian pronunciation here and there and a few dialect words that are just mixed in there. So for me personally, I don't really speak dialect, but as you said, it's kind of a generational thing. And my grandma, for example, spoke it a lot more. My dad can speak it, but he only speaks it with people who speak it to him. So like I can tell who he's on the phone with by the way he's speaking, because if he's talking to one of his friends who speak Bavarian dialect, he'll speak it too. But then as soon as he'll talk to me, he'll just speak standard German.
Do you feel like you're missing out on something if your grandmother spoke it and your father spoke it? Because we have this concept of FOMO, fear of missing out. And what we're finding in the Pennsylvania Dutch community is that younger Pennsylvania Dutch people, like my generation, your generation, they grew up with their grandparents speaking Pennsylvania Dutch, but they didn't learn it. They didn't pass it on to them. And now their grandparents, maybe they've passed on, or they're in their 90s or their 80s, and there's this sense of, I don't feel, and I get this from a lot of people on my channel and a lot of people when I go to speaking events and things like that, I don't feel complete because I know that in my Pennsylvania Dutch DNA, language plays a part, but I don't have that part because I never learned the language. And there's this sense of longing to reconnect with this language that they never actually spoke, but they heard being spoken, by parents or by grandparents. Do you get that sense too, at all, from your perspective as someone who, your grandmother, you said your grandmother and your father both speak this dialect, but you never learned it?
Not really. And I feel like it's probably because, as I said, I'm from a city. In the rural parts of Germany and Bavaria, dialect is still very much alive. Number-wise, it's definitely like dying out slowly, like it's spoken less and less, but it's still very much there. I mean, if you drive like half an hour out of Munich, you're going to hear very heavy Bavarian dialect. Yeah. And it's definitely cool. Like in the Munich area, there was definitely a time a few decades ago where dialect was oftentimes considered not as, what's the right adjective to use here? Speaking dialect was what the poor people did, kind of, and you were automatically putting yourself in like a lower class, social class almost by speaking dialect. Nowadays, some people will still say that that's the case. At least for Munich and Bavarian, where I'm from, I can say that Bavarian dialect is actually almost like a thing of like pride. The people who do speak it speak it proudly. And the people who don't speak it, like myself, wish that they spoke it. Like I wish I could speak it better because I can speak it, but it sounds like I'm speaking a foreign language. So I don't have the right pronunciation for it. I could like write Bavarian dialect because I'm so familiar with it, but it sounds like I'm speaking a second language, so it's just not like, I would embarrass myself if I spoke it in front of real Bavarian speakers, but it's definitely considered something cool. So if you go to Oktoberfest and you hear songs in Bavarian dialect, people will love it, and they're going to be like, this is so awesome, and people who do speak it natively are like really, really cool. So, but I don't personally feel like I'm missing out on anything.
Okay, I was just curious about that because that is something that a lot of people people talk about. It's a hot topic right now among my people, among the Pennsylvania Dutch here, particularly those that are in that 20 to 40-year-old range. Because now with the internet and things like exactly what we're doing here, with, the access to YouTube and social media, there's a lot more ability for people to connect with this language that, 20 years ago, if you didn't have that native speaker, or you didn't have someone in your family that spoke it, you had no other options, And now that's not the case anymore. That's one of the great things that I think the internet has greatly helped minority languages, ethnic minority languages like Pennsylvania Dutch and like dialects in Germany to not only preserve them, but also to advance them, I think, to a certain extent as well.
Yeah, I actually had a question about that because you said earlier that it's like frozen in time and it has been for such a long time. And I was wondering how the internet comes into play there because suddenly these communities that were separated from the rest of the German-speaking or Pennsylvania Dutch-speaking world were among themselves, and suddenly there's the internet and people start to communicate with each other. Is there like some kind of tendency that these dialects, because I know that there's regional differences within Pennsylvania Dutch too, right?
There are.
So are those like kind of all assimilating now, or is the language developing now suddenly because of the internet? Because there's suddenly like more influence?
It's a great question. I think the language itself is not assimilating. There will always be these regional differences. And a lot of it also has to do with, because of our cultures that fall under the umbrella of Pennsylvania Dutch, the sectarian groups, for example, which we haven't talked about yet, like the Amish and the Mennonites, they are not going to assimilate. And they're not going to be partaking in the internet and watching YouTube videos. But among what we call the non-sectarian Pennsylvania Dutch, people like me who grew up with electricity and, all these things, modern, you'd never know I wasn't not an American, et cetera, et cetera. What we're finding out is that with the beauty of the internet, you have people that grew up in our region in southeastern Pennsylvania, and then because of work or college or whatever, or they married somebody, they had to move away. And now they're living in North Carolina or California, but they have this longing for home. They want to talk about the foods that they grew up eating. They want to talk about the words that they grew up hearing. They want to talk about the traditions that they grew up celebrating. And that's where the internet has been really helpful too, for those people to reconnect to the culture and the language, or in some instances, their children to connect with a culture that they know that they are because their parents say, well, you're Pennsylvania Dutch. Your grandparents were Pennsylvania Dutch. But if you're growing up in North Carolina and not in where the Pennsylvania Dutch culture lives, so to speak, the internet gives them the ability to connect with us here that are here in the region, which I think is truly unique and a blessing too in a lot of ways. There's quite a lot of online language classes being taught. Through functions like Zoom, for example, where again, people that want to learn the language now have the ability to do it, where before that just didn't exist.
That's really cool. So with those classes, is there some kind of like standard Pennsylvania Dutch that's being taught? Or because we just said there's regional differences, or like who decides what is the correct Pennsylvania Dutch?
Whoever's teaching the class gets to decide, essentially. I mean, you're right. There is no standardized form. There's no standardized spelling either. There have been attempts in the past to try and make more of a standardization. And in some instances they've worked, and in other instances they haven't. Not having a standard spelling can be a hurdle to overcome. Most of the people that are teaching the classes do all agree to use a certain orthography, a certain spelling system. It's the one that I write in for all of the stuff that I do. That's the most common. Most of our literature that's been published, our poetry and our prose, was printed using that spelling system. It's not official, but it's what most people are familiar with, I guess I should say. But as far as the differences, there are regional differences, but they're not to the point that they make us incommunicable with each other. Yeah. I could get in my car and drive to central Ohio and go to Holmes County, where there's a massive population of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, and they are going to they're going to have a different accent from me, and they're going to use maybe a couple different words, but at the end of the day, we could sit down at a table, have a meal, and completely understand each other, no issues whatsoever.
Right. That's really cool. And the whole spelling thing really reminds me of Swiss German, because they don't really have their own official spelling system. Is there any official grammar? I'm assuming the answer is no, but... Well,
there is a grammar. There is a certain way to speak, and there are rules. And there are grammar books that have been published over the years.
Okay.
So the vast majority of people that grow up, speaking the language as Muttersprachler, they're learning that grammar, And the people that are teaching those classes, they're teaching that grammar. The biggest differences are between the sectarians, like we talked about, the Amish and the Mennonites, those groups, the plain people, they're called sometimes, and those of us that aren't, and we're looking at language-wise, again, we could talk to each other no problem. But what we find among the Amish and the Mennonite often is, for example, if you really know your German grammar, so we have the cases, we have the nominative case, the accusative case, and the dative case, and the genitive case. In Pennsylvania Dutch, we have nominative, accusative, and dative. We do not have a genitive form. We form our genitive differently in how we show that. But we have those three forms for those of us that are non-sectarian. The Amish and the Mennonite have dropped the dative case completely. They just don't do it anymore. They don't use it. And they've done that for, probably the last couple decades. They just dropped it.
Is there any kind of youth language or slang in Pennsylvania Dutch these days? Or has there always been, maybe?
Well, we don't have youth. No, there's no youth slang, that I'm aware of. No, that's a great question, though. But no, we don't. In that sense, it isn't a language that is changing as quickly as a modern, as English or as standard German. So slang is a kind of a difficult topic. We just don't really have slang like English or German does? That's a great question. No one has ever asked me that.
Even between you and your grandparents' generation, would you say there's like literally no difference in how you guys speak the language?
No, the only difference would be the things that we would talk about. So, for example, you know, like my grandparents have all passed, but if I was to have a conversation with them about like what we're doing tonight, you know, recording a video and you know, uploading to the internet, the vast majority of that I would have to say in English because we don't have the words. We don't have words for that stuff.
And you're not really bringing in new words to the language.
No, every now and then people try to invent new words, so to speak, when new technology comes along. There's some great examples. So when the radio was invented in the early 1900s, we had to come up with it. So there were some Pennsylvania Dutch people that just kept using the English word radio. But then there were people that came up with the word Schwätzkaste.
Oh my God.
It's a great word, isn't it? Isn't it a great word?
We should call it that in German.
That's what I refer to it as because that's what I grew up hearing, Schwätzkaste, which for those of you who don't understand, it's literally talking box. It's because that's what a radio was. It was a box that talked. And then the television came along. And then the decision was, well, and people started playing around with the language a little bit. And one word that has been invented, I guess you could say, and has stuck is Guckbox. So a box that you look at, a Guckbox for television. But things like computer and internet, computer, there is a word out there, but most people don't use it. I actually like the word a lot. Waterfresser.
Does it mean Wasser or what?
Wörterfresser.
Okay. Oh my God. Okay, interesting.
I really like that word, but most people in Pennsylvania Dutch speakers just say, "Ich war auf die Computer." I was on the computer, right? So, with technology, that's difficult. You know, as things constantly are being invented. For example, car. When the car came around, you know, in German, das Auto. But for us Pennsylvania Dutch, and I don't know why we decided to use this word, but we did. We called it die Machine.
Okay.
Ich bin die Maschinenführer. Yeah. So
just like machine in general.
We took the English word machine, right, and we applied it to car, to a car, and that's what most people will say.
So do you use the German word Maschine for other kind of things? Okay.
Nope.
So we already met you, at least my audience already met you in that one reaction video, but it was just like one little clip of you. So I would just be interested to hear a little bit more about your background. I mean, you already, I think, said that you grew up speaking Pennsylvania Dutch, so I guess it's one of your native languages, but how does that all work in your family? Has your family been speaking it for generations over generations?
Yes, yeah. I'm very blessed in the sense that my roots run really deep here in the United States, and I've done a lot of the genealogy, so I can take my family on both sides, my mom and my dad's, back really, really far, back to Germany and Switzerland. But we've been here, all sides of my family have been in colonial Pennsylvania since 1700.
Okay.
In fact, my one grandmother's side came in 1690 from Switzerland over Germany to here. My two children are 13th generation Pennsylvania Dutch in America. And we have been speaking the language for 13 generations. My wife and I are teaching it. Well, I'm teaching it to our children. My wife agreed. She's not a native Pennsylvania Dutch speaker, but she was 100% on board with us raising our children this way. So we raised them bilingually with English and Pennsylvania Dutch in the home. Growing up, I was very close with all four of my grandparents. They all spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. They all spoke English too, but it was a healthy mix of both growing up. I went to school. Well, that was all in English. So both languages were, in my head throughout the time of growing up, and it's still to today. And then eventually I started learning German and some other languages as well. And then today I'm a high school German teacher, German and history teacher. I spent some time in Germany. I did a year abroad in Paderborn in North Rhine-Westphalia at the University of Paderborn, which was a great opportunity, even though it wasn't the Pals. I was learning a little bit about more north central Germany when I was there. And through the school that I teach at, we have a partnership with a gymnasium in Baden-Württemberg in a little town of Buchen in the Odenwald. So every other year, I welcome their students to my school for a 10-day stay, and then we return the favor and we go over there for a 10-day stay and stay with them. So I get to travel to Germany back and forth quite a bit. So that's kind of my connections to German as well as the Pennsylvania Dutch stuff.
That's just crazy how your family preserved that language throughout so many generations. That must have been a very active decision. Yeah,
well, you're right. Although I would say that it really wasn't only an active decision in the last 70 to 80 years. So those first 250 years that my family was here, everybody was speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. That was the language. That was the language of the area where they lived. And there wasn't a lot of non-Pennsylvania Dutch living in those communities. So you didn't have that outside influence to speak English. What really hurt the Pennsylvania Dutch language from a number of speakers' perspective are the two world wars. So up until World War I, you know, if you would travel anywhere in the greater southeastern Pennsylvania region, if we time traveled to 1910 and you're on the streets of the town of Reading or Lancaster or Lebanon, which are cities in that part of Pennsylvania, you'd have heard Pennsylvania Dutch everywhere. You would have went into stores and everybody would have been speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. Well, World War I breaks out, and of course, Germany becomes the enemy, and it becomes, in some instances, dangerous to speak a German language in America when we're at war with Germany. And there was this big push, particularly during World War I, to suppress the language. And, you know, you're American, learn English, speak English, you got to be proud American, we're fighting this war, etc. So that was a hiccup. Now, a lot of the Pennsylvania Dutch were pretty stubborn. We're stubborn people. And, of course, we did learn English, but we also maintained the language. So there were families that lost it there around World War I. But then there were a lot of families that kept to it. Fast forward 20 years, World War II breaks out. Well, now it's, you know, Germany's the enemy again. And where does your loyalty lie? Are you an American? Do you speak English? You know, and that also was a big push for a lot of families to finally say, you know, we have this heritage, we have this language, but we don't need it anymore. You know, and after World War II, as industrialization happened and, you know, the 50s and 60s came along, well, then it really fell out of favor with a lot of people. It lost there was nothing cool about it. It didn't help you economically. So you don't need the language to survive. You don't need the language to advance your career. So that's when, I mean, the 50s and the 60s were the two decades that really saw kind of like the death knell for non-Amish, non-Mennonite Pennsylvania Dutch families, like my family, for example, that really, a lot of families, that was the cutoff. They stopped speaking it. They stopped passing it on to their kids. But there were exceptions. Luckily, my grandparents didn't completely give up on it, and my parents didn't give up on it. But that wasn't the majority of people, really.
I mentioned the anti-German sentiment or anti-German hysteria during World War I like many times on my channel, but I never really made the connection that it would have affected Pennsylvania Dutch speakers as well. Yeah. Because, like, I mean, it wasn't usually called Pennsylvania German, right? It
was never called that. Yeah, I mean, for the most part, you're right. And what also we see in our history, around that time of World War I, for example, the one-room schoolhouses where the majority of Pennsylvania Dutch kids went to school, that was English instruction. They weren't learning in Pennsylvania Dutch. And kids that spoke Pennsylvania Dutch in school or at recess, they would get hit by the teacher. So you can say that for a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch, we literally had our language beaten out of us. You know, we have this phrase, to beat a language out of somebody. Well, that literally happened to two generations of Pennsylvania Dutch kids. They grew up on the farm. They didn't know any English. They get to the school. They walk to one-room schoolhouse. Well, the only way they can communicate is in Pennsylvania Dutch. And this teacher's standing there with a stick or whatever. And, hey, it's English now. Well, I don't know any English, you know? Well, then we're going to beat it into you or beat the Dutch out of you. There are many, many stories of people that happened to them physically. Yeah.
Same with people who just spoke German who had come to the U.S. at a later point of time, or just like spoke more like standard German for the time. So you said that your family wasn't part of the Amish or Mennonites. So was that the case from the beginning? Like, you guys were always part of the, what do you call it? Well,
there's a lot of different terms you can use. So the main branches between, you can either call the two differences the sectarians, coming from the word sect, sectarian and non-sectarian. So my family has always been non-sectarian. The plain people and the fancy people, those are two terms that are used as well. Based on dress, they dress plainly and we don't, right? But when you look at the original wave of immigrants that came over in the 1700s, it was the Amish and Mennonite that came, and they stayed Amish and Mennonite. And those people came because of, you know, religious persecution in Germany. Nobody wanted them there. They were kicked out of towns. In some cases, they were, you know, tortured and burned, came to America, came to Pennsylvania. But the other big wave of people that came were non-Amish and Mennonites. Most of them were Protestant Christians, Lutheran or Dutch Reformed, what were known as the Dutch Reformed Church. And those were the groups that came. So you had your church Dutch, the people that met and practiced their religion in a church, like the Lutherans. And that's what all my family were Lutheran. And the Reformed, the Reformata. And then you had the plain people who don't have churches. The Amish don't go to church. They worship in their house, right? The Mennonites, depending on, there's different branches of Mennonites too. Some Mennonites do worship in a church, some don't. It depends on what group you belong to. But those divisions are pretty, if you look back throughout history, those lines never got blurred, because very rarely would somebody leave the Lutheran church and become Amish. Okay. The other way around, you would have people leave the Amish church, and still today that's happening, or leave the Mennonite faith and join a different church. Yeah. But going the other direction is very, very rare. Yeah. Very rare.
That's just what I was thinking. Like, maybe your family was Amish at first, and then like people left the Amish community.
No, and they were, in the first waves, the Amish were the minority. There weren't a lot of Amish that came, but they have continually doubled their population every 20 years because they have such large families. So, I mean, today, little known fact, they are the fastest growing ethnic minority in America, the Amish.
Oh, interesting.
Because, they literally double their population every 20 years. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. And they're the ones that are keeping our language alive too, because for them, language is part of who they are, and the Pennsylvania Dutch language is their language. Yeah. So, we talked about like people like me who, if you survived the 1950s and 60s, you were lucky. If the language survived in your family, you were lucky. Where the Amish and the Mennonite, well, they never went through any of that. The language just was always there.
And for you, for example, you have two native languages then, right? Like English and Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yes, I would. Equally. Yes. Yep.
Okay. I was wondering, where do you speak Pennsylvania Dutch except for at home and when you teach it?
Well, there are still quite a lot of festivals and gatherings and get-togethers that we have in Pennsylvania Dutch country. And like I was just at one on Friday night where I spoke, and everybody in the room was speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. So there's a lot of opportunities to go to those types of events and hear and speak the dialect. There's Facebook groups that people belong to where people are practicing and speaking Pennsylvania Dutch in those. There are essentially like stamtisch, but they're for Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. So these things do exist. And again, the internet is helping with that a lot. We'll never get to the number of speakers that we once had. I mean, we're all aware of that. But those of us that are trying to at least maintain and further the language, we feel that the work that we're doing is at least letting people know that this existed and it's still here. It's not some dead old language that is only on the shelves of a library somewhere.
And you still speak it with any other family that you have?
Yep, with my dad and other friends of mine, some distant relatives as well. Yep.
So like when they call, you just switch to Pennsylvania Dutch?
Yeah, or a healthy mix of both that and English, depending who I'm talking to. Yeah. And we're doing, there's a lot of people doing music right now in Pennsylvania Dutch too. That's seeing a great resurgence as well. And that's been really cool too. Talk about being hip, or it's becoming cool again. I have friends that are musicians. I'm a musician as well. I mean, I write songs in the dialect. And when we go to concerts or when we get gigs and we play those always get such a huge reaction from the audience. We can do a song in English and they'll enjoy that. But if we do a song in the dialect, or if we do a song about the culture in the dialect, those get way better reactions than anything else. It's really crazy to think about. It is cool, yeah. There's a lot of cool stuff out there to learn about the Pennsylvania Dutch, and Germans. I have a lot of people from Germany that are constantly contacting me, trying to build relationships, and we're building relationships between our two countries and our two cultures, and that has been an awesome experience, an absolute awesome experience.
Are there Germans who are trying to learn Pennsylvania Dutch?
Yes, and actually, what we're seeing a lot of recently is more and more Germans, particularly from the region where we come from the Palatinate, that are coming to Pennsylvania on vacation. To see the sights, to meet people, to talk the language, to go to our festivals. We have a massive festival every year the first week in July. The Kutztown Folk Festival, it's called. It's truly dedicated to all things Pennsylvania Dutch. And that'll see well over 100,000 visitors in the course of the festival. Okay. Sometimes 200,000, just depends on the year and what the weather's like. Last year at the festival, I ran into 12 different Germans who just got on a plane, wanted to come check it out, and they were staying like 10 days in Pennsylvania on vacation. It's like, it's so crazy to me to think like you have all these awesome places you can go in the world, and you're going to choose to come to rural southeastern Pennsylvania to be among my people and to eat our food and to, you know, celebrate with us. I'm glad that they're choosing to do that. We have 2 organized trips that are coming up next year that are already full. It's 3 busloads of Germans that are coming over for the festival just to do that. Yeah, it's really crazy.
Some of them who are basically tracing back some of their ancestors' traces, like where, like, I guess not all of their ancestors obviously went to the US because otherwise they wouldn't live in Germany, but
right.
Maybe some of them did, and they're trying to follow those routes. Or
we find that yes, and likewise we have a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch that go to Germany to do that as well, to go to the town where their relative left from, etc. But we do have Germans that are coming here to do that, but we also get a lot of Germans that are coming over just to, like, they just can't believe that this exists. That there's this area in the United States that they can go and speak their regional dialect with. And it blows their minds. And what we find is that, you know, our sense of humors are typical. What we find funny is the same. How we act with each other is similar. You know, it's like 300 years have passed, but in some senses, 300 years hasn't passed. And that's what keeps me going. I find that's
fascinating.
So fascinating.
Yeah.
It's so true. When I'm in the Pfalz, I feel at home. I truly feel at home. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was from Germany who was just here last year for the first time. And he said the same thing. He was at my house and we were having a picnic and it was summer, and he's sitting and he goes, I feel like I'm at home here. And he'd never been here before. It's really, that almost gives you goosebumps when you think about that. The power of this cross-cultural, cross-continent relationships that we're building just because of an old language, right?
Especially since you would think that in Germany, everything has developed so much because things weren't really like kept in a time capsule type of thing.
Yeah.
But still, there are so many similarities. That's crazy.
Yeah. It's awesome.
Thank you so much to Doug for taking the time to teach me and us so much about the Pennsylvania Dutch language and community. If you have any follow-up questions, just put them in the comments below, and make sure to also check out Doug's YouTube channel and his podcast, where he talks all about Pennsylvania Dutch and even teaches the language. I was a guest on episode 74 of his podcast, by the way. It's called Doug's Front Porch, so make sure to check that out on YouTube or your favorite audio streaming platform. And Doug was even part of a documentary called Hiwwe Driwwe, where he traveled to Germany to discover the roots of his ancestors in the Palatinate region and find out how much he still has in common with the locals there. You can stream that on Amazon Prime if you're interested. Here are all of my social media handles if you want to follow me outside of YouTube. And if you click here, you'll get to my first video with Doug, and here you'll get to my Pennsylvania Dutch video from last year. And with that, I hope I'll see you next time, or to say it in Pennsylvania Dutch, sehen dich später!